Why is there footage of World War II German soldiers on Instagram with 1 million likes? Seriously, think about that for a second. A reel of Wehrmacht soldiers marching, tiger tanks rolling, black and white footage from 1943, and it has 1 million likes. The comments are full of young people who were not alive during the Cold War, let alone the Second World War. And it is not just the Germans. Roman legions on TikTok, footage of the Colosseum, reconstructions of ancient battles, edits of Roman soldiers with dramatic music, millions of views. Napoleon quotes going viral. Alexander the Great getting the same treatment as a modern celebrity. The British Empire being discussed by teenagers who have clearly spent more time reading about it than their entire school history curriculum covered. Why? What is actually going on here? Because a few years ago this would have been unthinkable. Footage of German soldiers getting 1 million likes on Instagram. The cultural police would have been activated immediately. The stigma around it was enormous. You did not casually post content about the Wehrmacht and expect anything other than being called a Nazi. The approved cultural rules around this specific history were very clear. You engage with it in the correct way, through the correct framework, with the correct conclusions preloaded, or you did not engage with it at all. And Gen Z has just completely abandoned that, not in a reckless way, not in an ignorant way. They have just decided that the stigma is not the point, the history is the point, and the history, all of it, not the approved version, not the managed version, the actual record, is too interesting to leave behind because someone decided it was culturally uncomfortable. This is a generation that has grown up being told what to think about everything, every historical event, every cultural figure, every political question, prepackaged with the correct conclusion attached. Here is what happened, here is what it means, here is how you are supposed to feel about it, and at some point, quietly, across millions of phones and laptops and YouTube accounts, an entire generation decided it was done with the pre-packaged version and went looking for the real one. That is what this video is about. Not just why Gen Z loves history, why they have specifically abandoned the rules around it, why the stigma's dissolved, why a reel of tiger tanks gets 1 million likes without anyone losing their mind about it, and what that tells you about where this generation actually is and where it is going. Start with the data, because it is more striking than most people realize, and think about what the present has given Gen Z as a framework for understanding the world. The institutions have failed them, the political class does not represent them, the media cannot be trusted, the economy does not work for them, the housing market is inaccessible, the job market is broken. The platforms they were raised on were designed to addict them and extract value from them. The educational system gave them credentials that the labour market has stopped valuing. Every major institution that was supposed to provide a framework for understanding how the world works and what their place in it is has proven itself either incompetent or actively hostile to their interests. And into that vacuum, history. History gives you something the present cannot currently provide. Pattern recognition. The specific comfort of knowing that what looks completely unprecedented has happened before. That the dynamics you are watching in real time, the wealth concentration, the institutional capture, the cultural fracture, the political class that has stopped representing the people it governs, have a record. They have played out before. They have trajectories, and the generation that understands the trajectories is the generation that is not surprised by what comes next. That is what Gen Z is actually doing when they consume history at this scale, not escaping, not being nostalgic, decoding, using the past as the only reliable tool available for making sense of a present that the institutions of the present cannot explain honestly. Now let's talk about the specific histories that are pulling them in, because it is not random. Alexander the Great, dead at 32, conquered the known world. From Greece to Egypt to Persia to the edges of India. By the time most people today are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives, he was tutored by Aristotle. He slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. He wept when he had no more worlds to conquer. For a generation of young men who have been told that the traditional paths to achievement and status are increasingly closed, that the house is unaffordable, the career ladder is broken, the degree does not deliver what it promised, Alexander represents something specific. He did not accept the doors that were open to him. He went through the walls. He created a framework for achievement that did not depend on the existing structures recognizing his worth. He built his own thing, and the existing structures had to deal with it. That is not just a historical observation, that is a mirror for a generation that is being forced to build its own thing, because the existing structures have stopped delivering. The Alexander obsession is not about warfare or conquest in any literal sense. It is about the specific psychological posture of someone who looked at the world as it was, and decided to engage with it on his own terms. The Aristotle connection is equally important. Alexander did not just conquer, he thought. He was genuinely intellectually curious about the peoples he encountered, the geography he crossed, the philosophies he found in the territories he took. The combination of action and thought, of doing and understanding, is the specific combination that Gen Z is looking for in historical figures, because it is the combination that is completely absent from the political and cultural class that is supposed to lead them. Nobody in Westminster or Washington looks like someone who has both the intellectual depth and the practical courage to do something real. Alexander was both, and Gen Z notices Napoleon, born in Corsica in 1769. His family was minor nobility, but genuinely poor. He arrived at the French military academy unable to speak French fluently, mocked by classmates for his accent and his background, an outsider from an island that had only recently become French territory. He graduated 42nd out of 58 students. He was not supposed to amount to anything in particular. By 35, he was Emperor of France and had restructured the military, legal and administrative architecture of Europe in ways that are still visible today. The Napoleonic Code, the legal framework he imposed across the territories he controlled, is the foundation of the legal systems of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Quebec, Louisiana, and much of Latin America, written in 1804, still shaping how hundreds of millions of people experience the law in 2026. The specific appeal of Napoleon to Gen Z is similar to the appeal of Alexander, but with a modern edge. Napoleon's rise happened in the specific context of a society whose traditional structures had just collapsed. The French Revolution had destroyed the old aristocratic order. The rules that had governed who could rise and who could not were gone. And in that vacuum, a young man from nowhere, with no inherited advantage, with nothing except intelligence and ambition and a specific capacity for understanding what a situation required. That man rose faster and further than anyone in the previous structure would have thought possible. Gen Z is living in a moment that feels structurally similar. The old paths are not working. The traditional routes to security and status, the degree, the career ladder, the house, the pension, are no longer reliably available. The rules that governed the previous generation's rise have changed, and the Napoleon story is, among other things, a story about what becomes possible when the rules change, when the inherited advantage stops being the determining factor and something else, intelligence, adaptability, the willingness to work with conditions as they actually are rather than as they were supposed to be, becomes what matters. Napoleon also fascinates because of his fall. Waterloo, St. Helena, the island in the South Atlantic where he spent the last 6 years of his life, slowly dying, dictating his memoirs to anyone who would listen, constructing the legend of Napoleon that he wanted to leave behind. The man who had been the most powerful person on Earth ended up with nothing but his own narrative. And Gen Z, a generation that has grown up acutely aware of the gap between the image someone projects and the reality underneath it, finds something deeply honest in that final act. Napoleon understood that the story mattered as much as the substance. He spent his exile managing his legacy. It is the oldest form of personal branding, and the generation that invented personal branding recognizes it immediately. Rome. The memes are not just memes. When the Roman Empire memes started spreading a few years ago, the jokes about thinking about the Roman Empire, the ironic references to bread and circuses, the serious underneath the joke engagement with what it actually felt like for Romans living through the collapse. Something real was happening. A generation was using humor as a vehicle for a genuinely serious question. What does it feel like to live inside a civilization that is declining? Were people aware? Did they know it was ending? The answer, and this is the answer that hits hardest, is mostly no. The people living through the decline of Rome mostly did not experience it as decline. They experienced it as normal life. The economy still functioned, the games still happened, the administration still processed its paperwork, the army still patrolled, the structures were still there. They were just gradually becoming less effective, less trusted, less capable of delivering what they had once delivered. It happened slowly enough that each individual generation experienced something not dramatically worse than the generation before it. And then one day the structures that had seemed permanent were gone. Gen Z is asking this question about their own moment. Are we aware? Do we know what is happening? Can you see it clearly when you are inside it? The Roman Empire memes are a way of asking whether 2026 is a moment that will be obvious in retrospect, in the way that the late Roman Empire is obvious in retrospect. And the uncomfortable answer, which every serious historian of Rome will tell you, is that it always looks obvious afterwards and almost never looks obvious from the inside. The specific Roman dynamics that Gen Z finds most resonant are documented by the historians of the period themselves. Juvenal on bread and circuses, the specific mechanism by which the political class managed a population that might otherwise have noticed what was happening to them. Give them enough entertainment and enough food and they will not ask the dangerous questions. The bread and circuses of 2026 are more sophisticated and more personalised than the Colosseum, but Juvenal described the mechanism with such precision that reading him in 2026 feels like reading a diagnosis of the current moment. Tacitus on the decline of civic virtue, the specific erosion of the qualities that had made Rome capable of governing itself, the willingness to serve, the capacity for genuine sacrifice, the understanding that the Republic required something from its citizens beyond the consumption of what it provided. Tacitus watched these qualities drain away and described the drainage with a precision that is almost unbearably contemporary. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, identified the key mechanism as internal rather than external. Rome was not defeated, it decayed. The barbarians did not destroy something that was functioning. They occupied something that had already stopped functioning from the inside. The external threat only became decisive because the internal capacity to respond to it had been eroded by a specific set of dynamics: the concentration of wealth, the hollowing of institutions, the replacement of genuine civic engagement with spectacle and consumption, that Gibbon documented across 6 volumes. Gen Z has read enough history to know that Gibbon's description of Rome sounds uncomfortably familiar. They did not need to be told this. They noticed it themselves. That is the instinct. To examine the motives and the patterns without being told what to conclude. That the Arolsen Archive study identified, and that makes this generation's historical obsession different from any previous generations. The British Empire, the largest empire in human history. An island nation of approximately 10 million people in the 18th century, governing territories that eventually contained a quarter of the Earth's land surface and a quarter of its population. The specific mechanics of how this was achieved, how 10 million people on an island managed to administer 300 million Indians, and vast stretches of Africa and Australia and Canada and the Caribbean, is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history, and Gen Z is consuming it at a level that the British educational system never encouraged. The British Empire appeals to Gen Z for several distinct reasons that are worth separating. First, the sheer audacity of the thing. The scale of ambition required to look at a map of the world and decide that your island nation is going to administer most of it. The specific combination of military technology, administrative innovation, and cultural confidence, or arrogance depending on your perspective, that made it possible. Gen Z, living in a moment when ambition itself has been somewhat pathologized, finds something viscerally exciting about a civilization that operated at that scale. Second, the decline. The British Empire went from the peak of its power in the late Victorian era to effectively finished within 50 years. The First World War bled it. The Second World War bankrupted it. The empire that had seemed permanent, that Kipling had celebrated and simultaneously warned against in 1897, dissolved faster than almost anyone inside it had expected. The speed of the dissolution is as instructive as the rise. Things that seem permanent are often not. Structures that look like the fixed backdrop of reality can change faster than the people inside them can process. Third, the moral complexity. The British Empire was simultaneously one of the greatest feats of human organisation and administration in history, and one of the most extensive systems of exploitation and domination ever constructed. It abolished the slave trade and enforced it for decades before abolishing it. It brought infrastructure and law to territories that had neither and extracted resources from those territories on terms that served the metropole. It produced literature and philosophy and science that changed the world, and committed atrocities that its official history preferred to minimize. Gen Z does not want the managed version of this, they want the full complexity, and the full complexity is more interesting than either the triumphalist version or the purely condemnatory version. The school curriculum gave Gen Z a thin, safe, conclusion-first version of history. Here is what happened. Here is what it means. Here is the lesson you are supposed to take from it. The internet gave them the actual record, primary sources, conflicting accounts, the historians who disagreed with the consensus, the documents that the official version preferred not to emphasize, And the real version, the complex, contradictory, fascinating, difficult real version, is incomparably more interesting than what they were taught. The World War II obsession deserves its own examination because it is the most intense and the most specific of all the historical fascinations Gen Z has developed. And the reason it is so intense is not the one that the people who study this phenomenon tend to reach for first. Yes, the scale is staggering. Yes, the moral stakes were enormous. Yes, the technology and the logistics and the sheer human drama of it are compelling. But Gen Z has access to documentaries about every war in history, and most of them do not generate the specific obsessive engagement that WW2 does. Something specific about this particular conflict speaks to something specific about this particular moment. The World War II obsession is about the question of how. How did it happen? How did a modern, educated, culturally sophisticated European nation produce the Third Reich? How did ordinary people, people who loved their families and went to church and worried about their mortgages and complained about the weather, end up participating in or enabling or simply tolerating what happened? How did the institutions that were supposed to prevent the worst outcomes fail to prevent them? How did the propaganda work on people who were not stupid? How did the checks and balances that were supposed to be in place stop functioning? These are not questions about a distant historical period. They are questions about a pattern, the pattern of how democracies fail, the pattern of how institutions get captured, the pattern of how ordinary people end up on the wrong side of history without ever intending to be there, the pattern of what the early stages look like before the point of no return. Gen Z is asking these questions because they live in a moment when the institutions of democratic governance in America, in Britain, in most of Western Europe, have demonstrated specific and documented failures that look, to a historically literate generation, uncomfortably like early-stage versions of patterns they have studied. The capture of democratic institutions by concentrated financial interests, the use of media to shape rather than inform public opinion, the political class that has stopped representing the population it governs and started representing the interests that fund it, the economic conditions that produce the specific mixture of anxiety and resentment that historically has been the precondition for authoritarian politics. They are not predicting a return of the 1930s. They are doing something more sophisticated than that. They are pattern matching. They are using the most thoroughly documented example of democratic failure in the historical record to identify the specific dynamics they should be watching for in their own moment. And they are doing this not because anyone told them to, but because they went looking for the tools to understand what they were seeing, and the Second World War is the best documented case study available. The German side of the World War II obsession is particularly intense and particularly instructive. Gen Z is not just fascinated by the Allied victory, they are deeply interested in how the German side worked, what motivated the soldiers, what ordinary German civilians experienced, what the propaganda looked like from the inside, how the people who built and operated the camps understood what they were doing. The Hannah Arendt concept of the banality of evil, the specific insight that evil on an industrial scale is usually not perpetrated by monsters, but by ordinary bureaucrats doing their jobs, resonates with a generation that has watched ordinary people in ordinary institutions produce genuinely harmful outcomes without any malicious intent. This is the psychological test of courage that the Arolsen Archives study identified. Gen Z is not approaching this history to reconfirm conclusions already reached. They are approaching it to genuinely understand how it was possible, and the answer, that it was possible because of specific structural conditions that allowed specific mechanisms to operate, not because Germans were uniquely evil or uniquely susceptible, is an answer that has direct contemporary application. If the conditions matter more than the character, then the question is always what the conditions are, and that is a question worth asking about 2026. The resistance stories within World War II history are equally compelling to this generation. The White Rose, the July 20th plot, the individuals within the German system who retained the capacity to see what was happening and chose to act against it at enormous personal cost. These are not just inspirational stories, they are case studies in the specific psychological and moral qualities required to maintain clarity inside an institution that is doing something wrong, and for a generation that is going to spend their working lives inside institutions, corporations, governments, media organizations, financial systems that have demonstrated specific capacity for producing harmful outcomes. The resistance stories are the most practically relevant history available. This is the specific moment when the history obsession became possible at scale, The internet did not just give Gen Z access to more history, it gave them access to unmanaged history, history that had not been filtered through an educational system with specific ideological commitments about what the past meant and what lessons should be drawn from it. History as it actually was, chaotic, contradictory, full of people making understandable decisions in impossible circumstances, producing outcomes nobody intended and nobody could have predicted. The specific YouTube channels and podcasts that have built enormous audiences around history are doing something that the school curriculum failed to do. They are treating history as interesting, as the most interesting thing there is, as an inexhaustible supply of stories about real people facing real choices with real consequences, and the generation that was told to sit down and memorize dates for an exam and then regurgitate them in a controlled environment found out that history, approached honestly, is nothing like that. It is the story of how everything that exists came to be. Why the map looks the way it does, why certain languages are spoken in certain places, why certain legal systems operate in certain ways, why certain countries are rich and others are poor, why wars started and why they ended and what they produced and what they destroyed. History is the explanation for the present, and Gen Z, living in a present that desperately needs explaining, has discovered that history is the only honest explanation available. Now, the philosophical dimension, because the history obsession does not exist in isolation. It is accompanied by what can only be described as a philosophy revival among young people that has no real parallel in recent decades. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. The Stoics have become unexpectedly central to the self-improvement culture of Gen Z and millennials, not as academic exercise, not as material for a university course, as practical philosophy, as a daily operating system for navigating conditions that cannot be controlled. The specific appeal of Stoicism to a generation that cannot afford a house, cannot find stable employment, and is watching the political class fail them in real time is not mysterious. The Stoic proposition that the external circumstances of your life are not within your control but your response to them is exactly the proposition that makes sense when the external circumstances are genuinely terrible and the institutions that were supposed to improve them have stopped functioning. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the world, Emperor of Rome, commander of the most effective military force on earth, and he spent his evenings writing a private journal, never intended for publication, about how to remain internally undisturbed in the face of external chaos. The Meditations are not a self-help book. They are one of the most powerful people in history working through, in real time, the problem of maintaining integrity and purpose inside an institution that was beginning to rot. He writes, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." He writes, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He writes, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." These are not complicated ideas, but they are ideas that land differently when you read them, understanding that the man who wrote them was simultaneously trying to hold together a Roman Empire that was already showing the signs of terminal decline, fighting wars on multiple frontiers, dealing with a court full of people who wanted to use him for their own purposes, and trying to be a decent human being inside all of it. The Meditations are not the reflections of a philosopher in a quiet room. They are the reflections of a man under enormous pressure, trying to remember what matters and stay connected to it. Gen Z reads them and finds something they did not expect to find in a 2,000-year-old text. Someone who sounds like they are dealing with the same problem. Epictetus was a former slave. Born into bondage, physically disabled, he built one of the most influential philosophical schools of the ancient world through the power of his thinking alone. The Enchiridion, the handbook, that his students compiled from his lectures, is 53 short chapters that can be read in an hour and thought about for a lifetime. His central distinction in between what is up to us and what is not up to us is the whole of Stoic philosophy compressed into a single sentence. What is up to us are our judgments, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, the things that are genuinely ours. What is not up to us, our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, positions of power, all the things that depend on others or on circumstances outside our control. Most human unhappiness, Epictetus argues, comes from treating things that are not up to us as if they were, and things that are up to us as if they were not. For Gen Z, a generation that has been handed a set of genuinely terrible external circumstances and told that their inability to navigate those circumstances successfully is a personal failure, Epictetus is liberating. Not because he says the circumstances do not matter, but because he redirects the question. The question is not whether you can control the housing market, or the job market, or the political class, or the cultural apparatus. You cannot. The question is what you do with the part that is genuinely yours. The thinking, the attitude, the effort, the character. Seneca on time is the one that hits Gen Z hardest. He opens his letters to Lucilius with a line that reads as if it was written for someone scrolling their phone at 2 a.m. Ita fac mi Lucili, vindica te tibi. Do this, my dear Lucilius, claim yourself for yourself. He argues that most people do not lose time. They have it taken from them without noticing, in small pieces, by obligations and distractions and the demands of others and the specific modern equivalent of what Seneca was describing, the endless scroll, the notification, the platform that is competing for every available second of your attention. Seneca's argument is not that you should become a hermit. It is that time is the one genuinely non-renewable resource, and the failure to take it seriously is the most common and most costly human mistake. A generation that has watched its time being systematically harvested by attention economy platforms, that has lived inside systems explicitly designed to capture and monetize every available moment of consciousness, finds Seneca's argument about the protection of time more immediately relevant than any contemporary self-help book, because Seneca is not telling them to be more productive or to optimize their morning routine. He is telling them that the time is theirs and that giving it to things that do not deserve it is a form of dying before you are dead. Nietzsche. More difficult, more dangerous, more relevant. The German philosopher who declared that God is dead and then spent the rest of his life working through what that means for a civilization that had built its moral framework on the assumption that God was alive. The death of God for Nietzsche was not a celebration. It was a diagnosis of a crisis. Remove the external authority that had provided the foundation for morality and meaning, and you are left with either the creation of new values from within, which requires enormous psychological courage and strength, or the collapse into nihilism, into the last men who blink complacently and ask what is happiness. The Last Men passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra reads as a precise description of the consumer society that the attention economy has produced, a society of people who have invented happiness, who are comfortable, who avoid difficulty, who warm themselves by small pleasures and great comforts, who have no aspiration beyond the maintenance of their comfort, who look at anyone who has higher aspirations and say they must be sick. Gen Z encounters this and recognizes something they have been inside their whole lives, the specific social pressure to not want too much, to manage expectations, to be realistic, to accept the conditions as given rather than attempting to change them. Nietzsche's contempt for the last men is not a moral judgment. It is a description of what a culture looks like when it has given up on the possibility of genuine human greatness, and the generation that has been told to manage its expectations is reaching for Nietzsche because he is one of the few thinkers who simply refuses to accept that managing expectations is the appropriate response to a bad situation. The history and philosophy revival are the same phenomenon. They are both expressions of the same search for a framework, for pattern recognition, for the tools to navigate a moment that the contemporary institutions cannot honestly explain. And here is something that nobody is quite saying directly. The generation that is obsessed with history is also the generation that is building the new independent media that is replacing the old guard. The YouTube channels and podcasts and Substacks that are pulling millions of young viewers away from the mainstream commentary class are disproportionately built around exactly this combination: historical depth, philosophical framework, honest analysis of current events without a donor class to protect. The history obsession and the independent media revolution are connected. They are both expressions of a generation that went looking for the real version of things and found that the official version had been managed in ways that served interests other than truth. The generation that taught itself history is teaching itself to see through the managed version of the present using the same skills. Pattern recognition, primary source examination, the willingness to look at what actually happened rather than what was supposed to happen, the refusal to accept the conclusion before the evidence. There is also something worth saying about the specific quality of knowledge that genuine historical engagement produces that no other form of content consumption does. When you spend 3 hours watching a serious documentary about the Battle of Stalingrad, you do not just learn facts about the Battle of Stalingrad, you develop the capacity to sit with complexity, to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, To understand that the people on both sides of that catastrophe were human beings making understandable decisions in impossible conditions rather than props in a morality tale. You develop what the historian calls historical empathy. Not sympathy, not approval, but the capacity to understand from the inside how things that look obviously wrong from outside looked to the people living through them. This capacity to understand how things looked from inside a situation you are viewing from outside is one of the most important intellectual tools available. It is the specific capacity that allows you to ask the right question about 2026, not who are the villains, but what are the conditions, not who is to blame, but what are the mechanisms, not how could they, but how did it make sense to the people inside it at the time. A generation that has developed this capacity through serious historical engagement is a generation that is resistant to the specific manipulation that depends on the inability to think in those terms. The manipulation that presents complex situations as simple, the manipulation that assigns blame rather than examining conditions, the manipulation that gives you a villain to direct your anger at rather than a system to understand and change. Napoleon on St. Helena, dictating his memoirs, said, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon." He understood that the control of historical narrative was a form of power, and the generation that has rejected the agreed version and gone looking for the actual events is a generation that is, in a very real sense, taking that power back. The specific irony of the education system that tried to manage what Gen Z knew about history is that in failing to make history genuinely interesting, in making it a matter of dates and approved conclusions rather than genuine inquiry, it created the conditions for a generation to discover the real thing independently. And the real thing, discovered independently, is infinitely more powerful than the managed version delivered through compulsion. The student who memorizes dates because they have to retains nothing. The person who spends a Saturday watching everything they can find about the Weimar Republic because they want to understand it retains everything. The internet made the second kind of historical education available at scale for the first time in history, and Gen Z took the offer. The obsession with history is not a distraction from the present, it is the most serious possible engagement with it. Because if you do not understand where you are in the pattern, you cannot understand what the pattern requires of you. Gen Z understands where they are in the pattern, they worked it out themselves, without being told what to conclude. That is not a generation in crisis, that is a generation paying attention. And the generations that pay attention are the ones that write the history that comes after.